The newspaper has been the main source of information for millions of people for many, many years. The newspaper is a conglomeration of multiple works from multiple sources who have some type of qualification to be distributing information to people. The journalists who work for these papers have standards they must meet, and if their story isn't good enough, it is dropped and replaced with something more pertinent. But due to technological advancements, anyone can be a news source. The shift in ability has caused a change in the news industry as well. Clay Shirky says in his book, "The result is the mass amateurization of the efforts previously reserved for the media professional." In today's age of social networks and instant updates of any story, many aspects of the news have shifted from what's fit to print to what the reader wants to read. This change is the result of the lack of professionalism and the breakdown of rules in which a journalist is held to. Among these rules or principles is its first loyalty to citizens. Many people distributing information over blogs are not aware of these principles and would most likely not care about them. These new news sources pose a problem to not only the news industry but also to ourselves. With all the information moving around constantly, there's a lot of misinformation circulating with no one to regulate it until much longer after so much has been blown out of proportion. This craze of instantaneous information is having an effect on newspapers, causing them to change their layout, having more pictures, less text, and more stories of celebrity gossip. According to editor and publisher, the struggle to keep up has had newspapers adopting new ways of staying afloat since 1995. Matthew Ingram of Paid Content calls this a conflict between evolutionary change and revolutionary change. This idea is that to survive, the newspaper industry has to change and adapt, but with the addition of new technologies which offer greater informational yield and continuously post updates throughout the day, newspapers are now having to find ways to adapt because of this informational revolution. This revolution has caused newspapers to begin publishing more work on the internet and continuously posting updates when possible. This influx of information and attempted turnaround time may seem good for the reader, but the quality of work and the forum for which it is distributed often suffers. The reason the quality suffers is because not only is the work not being scrutinized as much as it would be to put out the next day because of the lack of time, but also because what may be fact can turn out to be a misunderstanding which leads to
但这对 NY Post 来说是小巫见大巫，他们头版大拉拉的错看。
This clip shows how the discrepancies in information are not only perpetrated by bloggers, but also news professionals, and how our mistakes are viewed by the rest of the world. Though the constant turning of information has become useful, receiving updates about breaking current events and better understanding the world we live in, we also shift from fit to print to what the reader wants to read. This is because, as much as news organizations not only present the reader with information, they also have a duty to entertain the reader. Neil Postman, in his book Amusing Ourselves to Death, says, "So we move rapidly into an information environment which may rightly be called trivial pursuit. As the game of that name uses fact as a source of amusement, so do our sources of news." He says, speaking about the radio, that news organizations play games with the news to keep the listener entertained and also a little informed. This concept also applies to newspapers in recent history in a way that makes them almost comical. A perfect example of this obligation to entertain in newspapers is the comics section. Though the comics section is very small in newspapers, most major papers have them and use them as relief from the heavy topics that surround them. There are many people, like myself, who only pick up a newspaper to read the comics section. Although this is not what Postman was talking about, it nicely illustrates the concept. We find ourselves dealing with comedy as a way to reach people and keep them entertained. But at what point does that entertainment become too much and start becoming the main message interspersed with news? As we have seen in our own lives, newspapers are becoming old technology, and people are starting to look for new ways of getting news, and as stated before, Now that anyone can be a news source, all you have to do is type a question into Google and it will spit back 1,000 results. We can see that the newspaper industry is dying by looking at the size of the newspaper today. Newspapers used to be fat, almost cumbersome things, stuffed to the brim with information from sports to finance to comics and everything in between. But recently, papers have shrunk in size due to the lack of demand for them and the accessibility of information on the internet. A study from the Pew Research Center shows a steady drop in the use of newspapers since 2001, with a heavy increase in internet usage to get news. The only demographic that is still holding steady, according to the study, is the 65 plus range. People over this age tend to continuously buy the newspaper, though it has gone through many changes, whereas most other age groups had dropped consumership of this medium by about half, and now supplement that with getting information from the internet. Because of this, newspapers have started fighting back by posting more material that used to be in the papers online and posting updates to the original stories as they unfold, trying to cling to the viewership that they still hold. This attempt is followed by many of the traditional users of the newspaper to the new information posted on the internet because of their loyalty to a news organization.